Something just came out about Lewis Hamilton's penalty record in 2026 that has completely changed the way people are looking at this entire season. And if you have been following this story, you already know it is bad. But what has now come to light is so much worse than anyone expected. Because this is not just about bad luck anymore. This is about actual flawed evidence, mismeasured timing lines, and a Ferrari team principal who is finally done staying quiet. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why Fred Vasseur looked genuinely stunned in front of the media. Why Lewis Hamilton's own words have started sounding less like frustration and more like a warning. And why some people in the paddock are now saying this title fight might already be, in their words, over. So let's start at the beginning of this penalty saga, because to understand how big this bombshell really is, you need to understand just how many times Hamilton has been hit this season. It started at Silverstone, his home race, the one race every driver dreams of winning in front of their own crowd. And instead of celebration, Hamilton walked away with two separate marks against his name. The first was a false start penalty, and here is where it gets almost unbelievable. The stewards handed him a 5-second time penalty for allegedly moving on the grid before the lights went out. But Ferrari's own sensor data showed absolutely nothing, no movement detected at all, and it was only when the stewards went back to onboard camera footage that they spotted something, a tiny rotation of the tire, a movement so small it measured just 42 millimeters, less than the width of your hand, and Fred Vasseur, when he was asked directly whether this was a mistake from his driver, did not hold back. He told the media, quote, "You are a bit harsh," rejecting the idea outright, and then he went even further, explaining exactly why this decision troubled him so deeply, saying, quote, "The sensors say the car did not move on the grid," before adding that while you could technically see a tiny dot on the tire shift on camera, he still found it, in his own words, quote, "a harsh decision when the sensors do not detect movement." But here is the part that made this so much bigger than just one penalty, because on that very same day, in that very same race, Hamilton was hit again, this time for allegedly failing to slow down for a yellow flag at turn 9 after Nico Hülkenberg stopped on track. And if you think that sounds straightforward, it gets messier, because the yellow flag warning that should have appeared on Hamilton's steering wheel display did not show up when he entered the zone, it only appeared later, and the steward still ruled that once it did appear, he had not slowed down enough. So in the space of one single home race weekend, Hamilton picked up two penalties, one based on a 42mm tire rotation his own team's sensors could not even detect, and another based on a warning light that arrived late on his own dashboard. And Vasseur, reflecting on the mental toll this was taking on his driver and the wider team, used a phrase that has since become one of the most repeated lines of the season. He said this kind of pressure builds, quote, "small stone after small stone," describing how each individual penalty might look minor on its own, but stacked together they start to weigh on everything: the driver's confidence, the team's strategy, the entire trajectory of a championship. And if you thought that was the end of it, you would be wrong, because the story kept going, race after race, first at Spa, then again at the Hungarian Grand Prix, where Hamilton was penalized for a pit lane speeding infraction, clocked at just 0.1 kilometers per hour over the limit. And this is where Vasseur finally lost his patience publicly, giving what has now become known as the same basket comment, explaining the full context of what actually happened. He revealed that the limit was 80 kilometers per hour, that the FIA's own data agreed Hamilton had been doing 80.5, and that Ferrari's own telemetry showed 80.6, meaning the actual overage was a number so microscopic it is almost impossible to comprehend as a punishable offense. And Vasseur, explaining the team's mindset in that exact moment, said plainly, quote, "When the weekend is going in the wrong direction, 0.1 kilometers per hour is a big delta, and we took the penalty." A quote that on the surface sounds like acceptance, but underneath carries a clear message. This team feels like it is being punished for margins so small they should not exist in professional motorsport. And here is the bombshell that changes everything, because it later emerged, almost quietly, buried in technical reports that most fans never even saw, that Formula One management's own timing system at Monaco earlier in the season had a flaw. The pit entry barriers had been physically modified, shortening the measurement line by 77 centimeters, which means the exact point where speed was being calculated was not where it was supposed to be. And if you shift a measurement line without recalibrating the entire timing system around it, you do not get accurate speed readings anymore. You get numbers that can be technically over a limit that, in reality, was never actually crossed the way the sensors claim, and once this detail started circulating properly among journalists and technical analysts, the entire narrative around Hamilton's 2026 penalty record flipped on its head, because suddenly this was not just a story about one driver having bad luck. This was a story about whether the very systems policing Formula One races are consistently accurate enough to be handing out penalties that can decide a world championship. And that is the moment Fred Vasseur stopped being diplomatic, because up until this point, every quote from him had carried a tone of frustrated acceptance. "We have to accept it," he said after the false start penalty, almost resigned to the idea that stewards do not explain themselves and Ferrari simply has to move on. But once the timing line discrepancy became public knowledge, his tone changed entirely, and insiders in the paddock describe him as visibly stunned when confronted with the full picture, because up until that point he had been defending individual decisions one at a time, race by race, but seeing them laid out together, 6 separate incidents under FIA review across a single season, connected by a thread of measurement inconsistencies and marginal calls, was something even he had not fully processed until it was put in front of him all at once. And Hamilton's own reaction throughout this saga has told its own story, because if you listen closely to what he actually said over team radio during the Hungarian Grand Prix, it was not just frustration, it was something closer to disbelief, telling his engineer, quote, "handing out penalties like crazy," and then doubling down after the race with an even more pointed statement, quote, "every opportunity that I give those stewards, every single time they give me a penalty." And when you put that quote next to the technical revelation about the mismeasured timing line, it stops sounding like a driver making excuses and starts sounding like a driver who may have genuinely been right the entire time. And this is exactly why the title of this story carries so much weight. Because the FIA drops a bombshell decision is not an exaggeration when you consider what is actually at stake here. If even one of these 6 penalties turns out to have been based on flawed measurement data, that changes race results, that changes championship points, and in a title fight where Hamilton now sits 50 points behind Kimi Antonelli after Hungary, every single point matters more than almost any other season in recent memory, because 50 points sounds enormous, but strip away even 2 or 3 of these penalties, recalculate the positions Hamilton would have held without them, and that gap suddenly looks very different. Maybe not closed entirely, but no longer the insurmountable wall it currently appears to be. And this is where the paddock is now split into 2 very distinct camps. On one side, you have people who believe this is simply the reality of ultra-precise modern F1 regulations. Margins have always been tight, and if the limit is 80 kilometers per hour, then 80.1 is technically over, regardless of how small that feels. Rules are rules. And Ferrari and Hamilton need to simply be more precise rather than complaining about measurement systems after the fact. But on the other side, you have a growing number of voices, including respected members of the media and former drivers, who are asking a much more uncomfortable question. If the equipment measuring these infractions has already been proven wrong once, at Monaco, with that 77-centimeter timing line shift, how confident can anyone actually be that every other penalty this season has been correctly calculated? And that question alone is enough to make this one of the most significant off-track storylines of the entire 2026 championship. And Vasseur himself, when pressed further on whether Ferrari has built any part of their season strategy specifically around managing Hamilton and these penalties, pushed back hard against suggestions that the team is simply making excuses, insisting instead that this pattern reflects something structural rather than something isolated to one driver's mistakes. And that distinction matters enormously, because if this really is systemic, a genuine flaw in how modern F1 stewarding interacts with increasingly sensitive timing technology, then this story does not end with Hamilton. Every driver on the grid could eventually be affected by the exact same issue, which means this bombshell is not just a Ferrari story or a Hamilton story, it is potentially an entire sport story, and that is precisely why the FIA cannot simply brush this aside quietly during the summer break. Because with the championship gap sitting at 50 points and 12 races still remaining, every governing body decision from this point forward is going to be scrutinized under a microscope by fans, journalists, and rival teams who now have a very specific, very technical reason to question whether the numbers on their screens can actually be trusted. And it is worth remembering that Formula One has been through credibility crises before, moments where fans lost faith in race control or steward consistency, and every single time the sport survived only because the governing body was eventually forced into transparency, publishing clarifications, adjusting procedures, or in rare cases quietly correcting the record, and the pressure building around this timing line issue has all the hallmarks of exactly that kind of moment, especially because Ferrari is not some small backmarker team that can be dismissed easily. This is Ferrari, the most historic name in the sport, fighting for its first title in years, with a 7-time world champion who has nothing left to prove and every incentive to speak the truth publicly rather than manufacture excuses. And that combination, a legendary team plus a legendary driver plus hard technical evidence, is exactly the kind of pressure that tends to force governing bodies to respond whether they want to or not. So the coming weeks during this summer shutdown might not just be about Ferrari's own internal preparation. They might also be about whether the FIA quietly reviews its own systems before Zandvoort, because right now silence is starting to look a lot more damaging than an actual explanation would be. So here's what we want to know from you, and I mean this seriously. If it turns out that flawed timing equipment genuinely cost Lewis Hamilton championship points this season, do you think the FIA has a responsibility to review and potentially reverse those decisions? Or once a penalty is applied during a race weekend, should it simply stand no matter what evidence comes out afterward? Drop your take in the comments below right now, because this debate is only going to get louder as more technical details come out. And if you want to be here the moment the FIA responds to this growing pressure, whether they double down, stay silent, or actually admit fault, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications immediately, because we are going to be covering every single update on this story before anyone else does. So like this video if you think this bombshell deserves more attention than it has been getting, share it with any F1 fan who has been following Hamilton's rough season and needs to see the full picture, and I will see you in the next one.